In this episode, Ross shares his experiences in regenerative agriculture, discussing topics including conservation easements and how his work is changing public perception of raising cattle. He touches on the humble balance between his personal life and his professional career. He discusses his journey from starting his ranch 23 years ago to getting involved in multiple projects and working with A&W to his partnerships with Ducks Unlimited. Ross also discusses the importance of a systems thinking approach and the intricacies behind regenerative agriculture, his relationships within the conservation community, and the influence of his parents' strategic thinking and the significance of naivety and pushing ahead. This episode also explores Ross's optimism for the future of regenerative agriculture, driven by increasing recognition and interest from large food production companies, indigenous perspectives, and more. Ross is a deep thinker and has a broad perspective. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I want to cover many more topics, but we ran out of time, so I'll have to get back to him and have him on the show in the future. I appreciate you listening to Vistas and Voices, and as always, enjoy the conversation. Today we're going to be talking about regenerative agriculture, particularly in the sense of cattle and livestock. This is a hot topic and has been for some time due to emissions, sustainability, effects on the landscape. And the work that I've seen that you've been doing is really rewriting the story on what I believe most people think of as raising livestock. And so I would like to dive into how you're doing that, and then also how it benefits the landscape, and basically how you got to be where you're at today and the future that you look forward to. Your professional experience, you started your own ranch 23 years ago in Saskatchewan. You also work with Ducks Unlimited, you're program specialist there, and you have an annual young adults business boot camp, plus a great array of other experiences. Just looking at this, you wear many hats, and as I would say many ranchers do, but you also wear hats that are outside of your ranch, right? With Ducks Unlimited and the other programs that you work with. Do you ever find yourself between competing practices?
That's a really interesting question. I was thinking a lot about it after you sent it to me. And I think, when I first got into ranching, it stayed pretty consistent to today, is I found that the ranching can be a really humbling business. All of agriculture can be, but also a very rewarding business, and definitely a rewarding life to be involved in, in terms of raising a family and having community connections. And I think that really helps me stay balanced, both in my professional career and in private life. And I think I crave that balance. So, and a lot of the decisions that we have made and continue to make as our ranching business evolves is about trying to maintain that balance, both with a professional set of experience and the ability to sort of ground truth at home, but also structure the ranching business in such a way that it allows for the professional opportunities that arise to be taken advantage of. So, I mean, it definitely involves, you're sort of working, if you're working a full-time equivalent job, then you're also working, some percentage of a full-time equivalent ranching operation, and that changes over time and over the course of the year. So it's not that there isn't a lot of work to do, but the fact that there is that little bit of push-pull, I think it makes you better at both. I think it makes you a better time manager. And I think it keeps me a little humble and grounded on both directions. It means sometimes there are sort of time conflicts where you have to make a choice as to where your responsibilities lie and and what the priority for the day or the week or the month is. But I've been really fortunate that a lot of the professional work that I've done, even though the expectations were there for a certain amount of work, the flexibility to do that work has been awarded to me. And some of that comes with a little bit of a trade-off in terms of, the role I'm in currently with Ducks is pretty entry level in the big picture. And some of that is by design in terms of the ability of that field work that I do for Ducks Unlimited to afford me some flexibility on a daily basis, as opposed to a senior management position. And I do wrestle with that a little bit. I definitely have the experience to be in a senior management position, and I have been in some senior management positions in other roles. And so I don't know if I've completely answered that for myself yet. I do understand if I was going to go after a senior management role for a company, we'd shift a few things on the ranch to enable that. But I'm probably, compared to when I was, 35, not 47, I understand the trade-offs a little bit more, and the compensation would have to be sort of commensurate with that trade-off. So I don't know if that answers the question adequately enough, but there's definitely a constant push pull, but I sort of enjoy it. I think it's made me better at both, and it definitely allows me to evaluate those trade-offs probably more objectively than otherwise.
Yeah. You can almost come from a place of empathy or understanding from the other side, from being, because I think that conservationists and ranchers are typically seen on opposite sides of the fence. But you being able to balance both allows you to have both perspectives and really, as you said, balance those. And being able to work with both of those positions, do you have any Ducks Unlimited projects going on your ranch at all, or do you have any conservation easements?
We do have all of the grass that we have has conservation easements on it. We were a pretty early adopter in the province, and the Nature Conservancy of Canada was sort of the primary easement grantor in the early days. So all of our easements are with NCC. And so that is actually, as my, the role with ducks has developed, it's actually removed any potential conflict there, which is great. I did do some early, like in the early 2000s, I did some forage seeding work on some of our own land with Ducks Unlimited, but those agreements have all expired and are sort of in the past. So I haven't used any current Ducks Unlimited programming, and that allows it to be pretty nice and tidy. But I have had a long relationship with NCC and some other federal and provincial conservation organizations as well. So,
Yeah. So can you touch on, I guess, what a conservation easement is, and then how it benefits you, and also how it benefits the land?
yeah. Well, there's a couple of ways to answer that. I'll give you sort of my little history with them. Is after I finished grad school in Montana, I went to work on a big ranch that's now actually part of the American Prairie Reserve, just kind of southwest of Glasgow, Montana, along the Fort Peck Reservoir. And it's right along the CMR Wildlife Refuge. So absolutely gorgeous Missouri Breaks country. And when I was on that ranch, I got exposed to the ranch had been using its relationships with conservation organizations, specifically the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and selling conservation easements on their ranch to sort of facilitate the expansion of their ranching operation. And I think at the time when I was down there, it was something like the ranch was like 250,000 acres or something like that, and several thousand cows across a pretty big chunk of Montana. And a lot of it was deeded land mixed in with BLM land, but it was a pretty fascinating experience to get exposed to that country, but also to open my mind up a little bit to maybe quote unquote non-traditional ranching partnerships. And so after I left there and moved back to Saskatchewan, that ranch experience taught me a couple of things. One, it taught me that I could function at pretty well at a sort of a large scale. So that was sort of like I'd proved myself that I could do that work at a large commercial scale. So that was pretty rewarding. But the other thing is it really highlighted to me that maybe there's an opportunity for me to create that dynamic because I had an academic background in animal and range sciences, and I really wanted to have sort of control of my own destiny in terms of ranching. That may be the most likely partnership, and I didn't have any money, right? So it's like, it's one thing to have all these big dreams, but you need some capital if you're going to be engaged in agriculture at some level. And I might do it differently today, just given the cost increase. But then there was an opportunity with the price of land and some conservation easement legislation that had just been put into play in Saskatchewan. And some of the conservation groups were really looking for people to be sort of guinea pigs, so to speak, on the conservation easements. And I was young and naive, really had nothing to lose. And my parents' advice was, well, you're on your own on this, but we'll tell you something. If you're going to go bankrupt, you should go bankrupt when you're 25 instead of 55. And now that I'm closer to 55 than 25, I definitely understand why they gave me that advice, but it was really good advice. So I started to talk to NCC about, what can we do? Because I really wanted to ranch and didn't have any money. So like, how can I figure out how to get this done? So I actually used a paid conservation easement as the security down payment for the mortgage. And I dealt with the local credit union. They were really good to deal with on that. And so the money for the paid conservation easement went to the Nature Conservancy. I didn't even touch it, and went to the bank for the security on the mortgage. And I had a big fat mortgage, and there we go. You're ranching. So, and the terms of the easement are really I had lots of people tell me not to do it, and they were going to control your life, and it was going to be a nightmare, and it was going to be, all of your worst fears are going to come true. But I was pretty fortunate that I had a pretty solid backing from my parents in terms of their ability to interpret those documents and help me with understanding what the obligations and the requirements and the limitations were to that. So I was pretty fortunate to have that background. And it was pretty simple. No, as long as I didn't break the grass and drain the wetlands and fill it full of billboards or intensive livestock operations, I could sort of function as a working ranching operation. And I thought, well, okay, I really don't have anything to lose. And if this conservation organization can't work with a guy who has a master's degree in animal and marine sciences and pretty strong conservation ethic, it's probably not going to work for anybody in the province. So I guess game on. Let's see what happens here. I had people red in the face across board tables telling me that I was wrong and they should never do this. And banks wouldn't lend you money with conservation easements. Like everything you can imagine got said to that, but I didn't really care. I was too naive to know any different. And it's been a great, like I have never regretted that decision. And it allowed us a few years later to expand and sort of use the same model to get a hold of a little bit more grass on a ranch that had been there was a family relationship there, and allowed us to expand there. And then that relationship has it's opened doors for me in terms of access to skill sets within the conservation world that I don't have. So it's allowed us to grow in our understanding of the dynamics here. And it's also allowed us to grow in terms of our personal connections to the conservation world in sort of non-traditional thinking on expanding and land use policy. And within the last 5, 6, 7 years, sort of more of a realization of how these landscapes can be used as reconciliation as a treaty person in this country. And so that's sort of what's evolving now. And that I find that to be really exciting. So it's become much more than just me and some cows and some grass. It's become, uh, and that's been really rewarding.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's offered you a lot of opportunity to build relationships and a community that is, beyond yourself and your ranch. How how has that influence of community helped you make decisions on the ranch?
It's given me definitely a broader lens on the issues that we consider when we're designing our grazing management plan for the year. And it's definitely given us a broader lens on how it is that we communicate what we're doing to other people. And, and fact that we have 20 some years of history engaged in that community and understanding the wider array of species that depend on these grassland landscapes has really been sort of a benefit in a lot of the adjacent work that we have ended up doing. Like a lot of that background really fed pretty naturally into the relationship that evolved with A&W. And it's also fed into other relationships we've had with either other conservation groups or policymakers, or this summer we had a documentary film crew from France that showed up here. And a lot of that was just personal connection through those 20 years of relationships where it's like, yeah, here's a person that can speak to you about the challenges of livestock raising, but also has a well-documented conservation ethic and can speak to, decision making with more values at play other than just strictly extractive production.
Yeah. That's such a wonderful answer because you, being the guinea pig of the land or the conservation easement, as you said, do you think that has positioned you where you are today is to be a leader in regenerative ranching? Is that why, you are attracting A&W and these other documentary film crews? Because you have been doing it so long and you've proven that regenerative ranching can be successful?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing it's done is it's allowed me to be really pretty confident when I tell the story of what we do. And it's not just about, we're a rancher in this beautiful part of the country and this is what we do. And it ends there. It's like, well, yeah, the ranching is part of what we do, but we also are citizens of this country and we're concerned about these other dynamics and we're invested in these other dynamics, whether it's, biodiversity conservation or treaty land sharing or any of the multi facets that go into the decision making. And really that probably going through that initial baptism by fire on the conservation easement early days is really giving me the confidence that I can get through what some people may not be comfortable with and come through the other side. So I think it's probably the confidence as much as anything, because the one thing I've discovered over the years and I've tried to be really cautious about is not representing what we do as sort of a recipe, so to speak, in terms of our production practices, and be pretty open to the fact that there are some foundational things that drive us, and the grassland function is sort of the primary dynamic there. And we try to use that as the anchor. And if we stay anchored in that and try to listen, and then make our decisions on a yearly or multi-year basis, but be conscious that we need to constantly have that feedback loop to revisit what are the grasslands telling us about the impact we're having on them. Like, are we using that piece too hard? Could we use it harder from a grazing standpoint? Are there other values to that we can capitalize on monetarily, or are there other values to that we can capitalize on in terms of, being better treating people, or being better local community members, or better members of the broader agricultural community? Or so always staying focused on that, sort of with that grassland conservation ethic, and recognizing that that's our foundation. That's really kept us anchored, and we constantly try to go back to that. And that really, as it turns out, is what enabled the evolution of the A&W relationship to go where it did. I had, it was a pretty affirming experience, because early on in the relationship, they send out a crew of 20 people to come to your house, and there's a bunch of cube vans and sound people and lighting people and all this crazy stuff. And you have a microphone in your ear, and the advertising agency has the things that they want you to say and the touch points that, so you sort of go through that process to make these series of pieces for them. And the first couple of years, there was some frustration, and I knew why they were frustrated. And it's because I was saying things that they didn't fully understand. And what I kept coming back to was, yes, there are aspects of our management with the cattle that are, that we do. And that's, that was being part of the raised without hormone implants, and, the antibiotics protocols and all of that stuff. That's part of it. But really what this story is about the grasslands and the interaction of us and cattle and the grasslands, and keeping that whole thing functioning. In the first couple of years, they were a little frustrated with that I kept going back to that all the time. However, by the fourth year, there were a series of years where they kept coming back because they liked what they were getting. And by the fourth year, it was the same advertising agency, and it was the same guy in the earpiece in my ear. And he said to me, what I've just realized, Ross, is you've been saying the same thing to us for 4 years, but it's taken 4 years for us to understand what you're talking about. And this is actually a much better story than where we start. So that moment was pretty great, actually. And you could see it in the evolution of the conversations with the people. And so that was pretty great. And I wouldn't have had the confidence to get there without going through what I'd gone through 20 years earlier with some of the conservation easement activity, and those trying to bridge those relationships. So, when you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem like a very direct progression, but once you have a little perspective and you can look back on it, you think, oh, yeah, I don't know that I could have designed that when I was 25, but it's sure fun to see how it's all come together.
Yeah. I mean, some people will say life has a plan for you, and you just got to keep going, and then you'll realize it. And it sounds like that you've begun to realize it, or that's been reaffirmed to you. It seems like regenerative agriculture, I would say, traditionally came from a point of conservation and really, caring for the land and using the land as an indicator of your business. Aldo Leopold has a saying, or has a quote, that I'm going to misquote it severely here, but if you practice whatever your practices are on the land, if the land degrades, then your practices are wrong.
Yeah.
But if you practice on the land and the health sustains or improves, then your practices are correct. And so he's way before his time.
Yeah.
Some of his writings are incredible. Just recently recapped on it, and it's amazing. So that leads me to the point, coming from a traditional perspective of conservation. And then you have companies like A&W and McCain and Campbell's, and all of these large food producers are getting on the regenerative agriculture train. How is that exciting to you? And because they have a large capital, and they're able to, I would say, exponentially shift or grow the regenerative agriculture space. Do you think that, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I find it pretty exciting in a lot of with a lot of the same naive enthusiasm that I approached sort of the conservation easement dynamic with, because I think you sort of have a choice. Well, you do have a choice when you look at some of those dynamics, and your choice is to look at the company involved and immediately suspect that there's an ulterior, darker motive that somehow is going to creep up in the darkness of the night and slit your throat. Or you could look at it like, wow, maybe the time has arrived where the people who really make up those companies have a genuine interest in making things better. And if that's true, I really want to get connected with that. And I don't think it's that black and white in reality. I'm sure there are some companies that are just doing it because it's the trendy thing. But then there are also some companies no different than, our little company with two shareholders that it's what they're doing, right? And it's what they're engaged in, and it's that they're deriving absolutely their financial returns that have to drive that. But there are other aspects to it. And really it comes back to the people. And that's what helps sort of drive it forward. So we all have a choice of which way we view those dynamics. And I probably am optimistically naive on a lot of those relationships. But for the last 20 some years, that served me pretty well. Now I have definitely been educated a few times out of some of that naivety, but it hasn't, it hasn't weakened me enough that you think, oh man, I need to reevaluate my whole life here. And this has gone horribly wrong. It's just like, okay, lesson learned. Maybe next time I need to ask these questions before I dive in blindly on some of these relationships. And I don't know, I think that's just life. So, there's a really cool speaker that I heard in 2012. We had just started selling into a supply chain that was raised without protocol. So you had to document your antibiotic use, and you couldn't use hormone implants and that stuff. And we had just started to do that because our production model that fit with the grasslands fit really well into that production model. And we just started to do it in this pretty small scale for us, and it was I talked to a few people about it, but there weren't very many people doing it. And it was pretty small in the big picture. And just by happenstance, my wife and young daughter had gone to visit her family in BC. And so I thought, I need to, I'm going to drive out to this conference in Alberta, visit my sister, and go to this conference. It was a livestock conference. And the guy was Lowell Catlett he was a dean at New Mexico State University and a consultant to a bunch of Fortune 500 companies. And he gave that's over 10 years ago now. And his presentation still rings true. And one of the great quotes, or one of the great things that stuck with me from the presentation, was he said, we're wealthy countries in North America. And with wealth comes the expectation or the desire for differentiation in our purchases. And he said, if you liken food production to the automobile industry trajectory, when vehicles first started, it was one make, one model, one color, no options. And he said, now we have a variety of that, and we don't sell fewer cars, we sell more cars. So if you think food production is not going the same way, you're fooling yourself. So my advice to you, producers in the audience, is get aligned with a company that fits with what your operation can do, and stick, understand how that works and get in alignment, because that differentiation is only going to continue and it's only going to get more diverse. So we had just started, like, it really hit a chord because we had just taken the steps to try and engage in that. And he got a standing round of I guess standing applause and, standing ovation, and everybody thought it was so great. But it really hit home to me because we had just started to do it. I thought, okay, right on. This guy's a smart guy. He's been around. He's pretty proven. I'm gonna I'm gonna take that advice. And so that really cemented the direction we wanted to continue to go. And that's really what led into the relationship with A&W, was some of that groundwork. They were then became a customer of A&W, and then I made some of the connections when A&W launched some of their programming. But because I was able to sort of discuss these dynamics at a higher level well, not higher level, that's not fair, but a level that had some sound logic behind it, I think the relationship blossomed more quickly and resulted in some pretty productive opportunities for us. And so I guess when I see the big companies, whether it's Pepsi or Walmart or Cargill or whoever it is that's involved in that space and making those strides, I just think, right on. What that does is it creates opportunity for more people to sort of find their niche and fit in a stream that in some respects is much more fulfilling than just sort of strictly commodity production. Commodity production can be fulfilling when you hit the market right and the profit is good. Like, that's pretty fulfilling. But I'm kind of wired where I want a little bit more connection, and I want to understand a little bit more up the food chain. And so those connections have really facilitated that for us. I understand way more about sort of what happens after the cattle leave our ranch all the way through to the end consumer. That it's been a wonderful education on that. So, and I think that's where there's opportunity for more and more consumers, or more and more producers, whether you're selling direct to consumer or you're selling into a specified production chain, you're going to get educated on being closer to the end point. And I think there's value there.
Yeah, you are a beef producer, and you're talking about the whole system from essentially start from the grass to the end on the plate. And I would say your style of thinking is a systems thinking approach, where you really like to take a step back and view, your ranching or the system of the beef from start to finish from a bird's eye view. Where did you get this style of thinking? Like, where did
Yeah.
you learn it? Or yeah, could you touch more on that?
I think probably a couple of things. My parents definitely had a pretty big influence. They're pretty big strategic thinkers, and always encouraged me to be more thoughtful in my approach, I guess, to life. And we're pretty. I mean, it wasn't always easy when you're a teenager and you're sort of smashing around through life, and then your parents are cross-examining you about what you're up to and who was there and what was going on, and was that a smart life choice? But I think having that background helped set me up to be a more inquisitive learner, I think. And then I think a big part of it is I for a long time I was really self-conscious because I didn't come from a a farmer ranch that I was going back to. And so I was really self-conscious for a long time, probably too hard on myself in terms of doubting myself. But what it did is it made me work really hard at my on the ground skill set. So I became really pretty proficient at, you know, handling livestock and managing grass and understanding those interactions. Cause I thought, well, if I can prove myself there, then I'll be more accepted. And then over time, what you realize is, well, that's not really, you can't spend your whole life chasing other people's acceptance. But because I had worked so hard for that and felt a little bit less and less as you age, but felt self-conscious initially, it made me, because I didn't have any my dad wasn't there telling me what to do, or my grandpa wasn't there saying, look, kid, we've always done this way on this operation. So that's how we're going to do it as long as I'm alive. I wasn't shackled by that. I thought that was a negative when I was first getting started, because I just didn't have a tractor. So it's like, oh, I could really use a tractor to do that. Or I didn't have as many cattle as I needed. So it's like, oh, well, how am I going to get these cattle? And it's like, well, that fence needs to be replaced, but I have no equipment. So you have to think differently. And the other thing it did is it made me really evaluate where I was putting my energy into. And when you overlay that with having the ranch and having this growing professional career, really forced me to be an objective thinker on that and look at it probably more from what is the system that I'm trying to create here. And given my range management ecology background, I think that, because I understood sort of the systems dynamics of a grassland and how that functions to a degree, I think that overlaid into the management of the ranching operation and ultimately my life on there. And then once you start to understand how those systems work, then you start to crave it. Right. And because I wasn't held back by a lot of traditional thinking, or maybe not even traditional thinking, but wasn't restricted by what a family member might have been trying to tell me to do. I sort of craved knowing what were the next steps. And so then you find yourself talking to people that know about that and reading books about those systems. And then you find yourself wanting to know, well, okay, is my logic savvy? Okay, it's sound on the grassland. Is it sound on the cattle side of it? Okay, it's sound on the cattle side of it. Now, does that transfer into the finishing side, whether that's in a feedlot or a grassland setting? And if you find out that it does or does there, then how do you adjust and make that work? And then how does that translate into food production and the story that goes along with food production? So I think it just sort of builds on itself, and there's a lot of interrelationship there. And, a lot of that sort of like once you get exposed to some of that thinking and it becomes successful for you, the overlap in, how, what the expectations were from my parents and in terms of how I would defend what I was up to, what the expectations were from the grassland that I was stewarding in order to function properly. I had to think of it in a systems sense. And then when you get into more detail on livestock handling, both horses and cattle, there's a systems approach to some of that too, and understanding the bigger picture and trying to be objective and remove some of the emotion, but also understand some of the subtleties about where you fit in the cycle and where you put pressure and where you release and the timing. Like there's a tremendous amount of overlap. So it all just kind of fed into it. And I've been pretty fortunate to be exposed to some pretty good systems thinkers over my time, even though I didn't really understand it at the time. Sort of in that context, I've been fortunate. Some of it I went looking for actively, and some of it just sort of came together.
Well, that's good. I mean, if you didn't understand at the time, but you remembered it, hopefully you can understand it now, and it stayed with you. Yeah. So we're coming up on, we're at 40 minutes now, and I usually like these things to be about 50 minutes long. So I just have a few more questions for you. Some that I wrote for questions at the end, and we can go through these and then we can wrap it up. So is there anything that I should have asked you but didn't?
Probably what would I do differently? It's like if I could rewind to when I was 25 again, what would I do differently?
You want to touch on that real quick?
Yeah, I think the gut feeling or the instincts that I had then have held pretty true. And I would I would try to be a little bit more focused on a few things. And the people I wanted to connect with then, I should have worked a little harder with to connect with sooner, I think.
Fostering those relationships.
Yeah.
Okay. What does a successful future look like to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it's changed a little bit over time. I didn't used to write down my goals for the year at the beginning of the year, but I've started to do that probably in the last 7 or 8 years, just a couple every year. And what I've found amazing is that it seems like when I write them down, even if it's just one or two of them, when I look back at my day planner over the course of the year, it seems to follow. So I think continuing to refine my focus on being more thoughtful and where I put my energy, I think that's success. And a lot of that is trying to take the opportunities I had to be exposed to people that were influential in my life, pass that on to my kids, and I'm not saying monetarily, but just in terms of when I think back as to what had early influences on me and why it had influences on me, it's because there were relationships there and the relationships were fun, right? It wasn't always just about work, work, work. I mean, some of it was work, but the work was fun. And, and really, I think that's so as my kids are now getting to an age that they're big enough to sort of do a little bit of work, I have to keep myself focused on not just making it work. It has to be sort of stimulating. Uh, so I think that's success and really trying to use what we've put together in terms of the land base and the knowledge to help other people find their own successes, and whether that's, through treaty land sharing networks and those dynamics, or if it's just, things like this that might help somebody have the confidence to step outside of some conventional systems and follow their own gut on that. I find that to be more and more rewarding each year.
Awesome. I'm glad that you were able to define success in several areas. That seems pretty in line with your systems thinking, thinking ahead and having multiple goals. And then what makes you hopeful?
The fact that the change is happening pretty fast in the world as we're more and more connected, and as the stressors naturally increase as people are more and more connected, I think the related desire for change and on the ground impacts, I think that's growing much more quickly than it used to. And I'm pretty optimistic that, the stories that we've been a part of and the stories that we're interested in being a part of in the future have a broader audience than they did maybe 2 or 3 decades ago. So I'm pretty hopeful there.
Leaving a positive impact and positive change.
Yeah.
And leading by example.
Yeah. And the desire for a more integrated change as opposed to, just a single, more extractive change. The whole production agriculture world is recognizing slowly that they need to, yes, continue to produce top quality food for the world, but that they also need to be much more considerate of other aspects of the natural world and the community, and that people really, they desire it and they value it. And I just think in the big picture, some of that starts to move the further you go down that path. Some of that starts to get pretty close to an indigenous way of being in some respects. And, the notion that I've reflected a lot on, what does it mean if you're an indigenous person and you're disconnected from your natural or your indigenous environment? say that you would have been more connected to 250 years ago. And yet you still hold beliefs about an indigenous way of being. And, and I've got a good friend of mine is from Carry the Kettle, and we've talked about this dynamic, Carry the Kettle First Nation. And so his family history is linked to the grassland that we're ranching on directly, but he didn't grow up here. Now I have kids that growing up here. And yet we talk about these dynamics, and you think, well, the more we talk about these dynamics, the closer together we become. And really, is it because you're indigenous that you're inherently a better steward of this environment? Or is it that as an indigenous way of thinking, you're incorporating the health of your natural environment into how you manage yourself on that landscape? And so the more that we can sort of grapple with that question and understand the direction we're heading, really, in a lot of senses, the closer it gets to some of those core principles that have evolved over tens of thousands of years for the people that have survived here and thrived here. I think the better off we're going to be, and the more fulfilling that will be as citizens on this continent. So that's pretty exciting to me, that we can get. Sometimes it seems too far in the past, but the more I play it forward in my head, the more I think it might be closer than we think to come together on those concepts. So I'm pretty hopeful there.
That's a wonderful hope. In my education, we're learning a lot about that. I hold the same hope. I think that we have a lot of opportunity to steward the land better and to learn more than the traditional agriculture practices and resource management practices that we know, or that we have known for the last 100 years. I think there's so much more to it, and that we can, use the land for our benefit, but also regenerate the land, as in your case, you're doing as well. And then last but not least, that's a wonderful note to start wrapping it up on. Are there any resources that you'd like to share where people can learn more about anything that you've learned, that you found helpful, encouraging, or anything that you'd like people to learn about?
Yeah, well, that's a broad question. If you have any interest at all in sort of putting yourself in a good place mentally and communicating with, the person's pretty specific to horses, but it applies to so much more than that. Check out Joe Walter, has some clips on his webpage where they're just like 2-minute clips, and he talks about relationships with people and horses and livestock. Those have been a huge influence on me in the last decade. And it's really hard to narrow it down, but probably Fred Provenza's book, Nourishment, that has had that's a pretty fantastic book in terms of looking at some of the systems we're engaged in a little bit differently, and from a broader lens, and maybe developing systems that we can be a better part of. That's a pretty impactful book, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, thank you for those resources. I'm going to be sure to check them out. And thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's been awesome talking with you. And thank you for being a guest on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for asking, and good luck.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for learning with me today and dedicating your time listening to Vistas and Voices. Time is our most valuable asset, and I'm grateful that you chose to share some of yours with me today. If today's episode struck a chord with you, I'd be honored if you could share it with friends, family, or colleagues who you think would enjoy it too. Every share, particularly those made through personal recommendations, plays a significant role in nurturing our growing community. If you could take a moment to leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in, it would be immensely supportive. Your feedback is precious to me. It not only aids in enhancing our content, but it also helps others find our conversations. Please feel free to reach out to me via my website, www.thepursuitproject.org/contact, on Instagram @Tyler_Garwood, or on LinkedIn. Your thoughts, questions, and feedback are always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode, where I'll see you right here on Vistas and Voices.